Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the fifth debate of term and what promises to be an exciting week 5. The motion before the House this evening is this House would prosecute those who led the Iraq War over 20 years after the invasion. Just a few rules before we get into the debate. There are 6 speakers, 3 on the proposition and 3 on the opposition. They each have 10 minutes to speak on the first round of paper speakers, and then we turn to a round of floor speeches from you guys, the audience. There'll be a speech in proposition, opposition and abstention, and all of this lasts for 2 minutes. Then, afterwards, we'll go to another round of paper speeches. You have the opportunity to challenge speakers who you don't agree with. You can say, on that point of information. Please do try and keep this brief and keep it relevant to the debate for this evening. First of all, we have the first speaker for the opposition. We have Andrew Murray. Andrew Murray is Peter Irvin, sorry. He's a columnist for the Declassified UK and the Middle East Eye, having previously been the chief political commentator of the Daily Telegraph. He has written several books, including the biographies of Alastair Campbell and Basil, Not the Chilcot Report and The Fate of Abraham, Why the West is Wrong About Islam. You have the ears of the House.
Thank you. Want to stand here? Thank you very much for inviting me to the Cambridge Union. I as an undergraduate here at Christ in 1975, I watched Michael Heseltine engage with, it's a wonderful debate, Michael Heseltine engage with David Owen about Europe, and it was glorious stuff. And I've never spoken here since, and it's a great honour to do so. I'm going to make the case that those involved in the Iraq War should be prosecuted. And I'm going to start with taking an analogy from company law, which is if you float a company on the London stock market, the sponsoring bank and the company executives need to provide assets, valuations and profit forecasts, etc. And on the basis of that, investors value the company and they buy or sell, and invest in the shares. In the event that the asset value is misstated or the profit forecasts are wrong, then the Inspector Plod arrives and those concerned get charged and may well end up in jail for a long time. Now, in September 2002, Tony Blair presented, aided and abetted by the Secret Intelligence Service, which had provided the information, basically a prospectus for war. This was a war which was to create the most terrible carnage across the Middle East, not just kill 179 very brave British soldiers, but it was to lead to civil war on the most bloodthirsty kind in Iraq, lead to the rise of ISIS. It's far from solved. The Syrian civil war, it can all be dated to that. It was that we went to war on the basis of false information, presented to the House of Commons by Tony Blair, who grievously misrepresented the advice given him by the intelligence services on the floor of the House. But more than that, the stuff he got, but in any case, the stuff that came his way from the intelligence services was nonsense. There were no weapons of mass destruction. Now, you might simply say that, politicians lie on the floor of the House of Commons a lot. And that is true, and it's got more true since. Tony Blair, and that has been Tony Blair's defence, really, that he genuinely believed what he was saying. But by the way, if you are the finance director of a company being floated on the floor of the London Stock Exchange, it's up to you to make damn sure that what you say is right. And this is only a few £1,000s of investors' money is at stake, not hundreds of thousands of lives, British lives and those across the Middle East. But I also want to look at what the crime was. The crime which was committed by those promoting the war, not of course simply the British Prime Minister, but also George Bush, and also some of the advisors inside Downing Street, I would say. Now, the reason why Tony Blair needed to provide this dodgy information about weapons, false information about weapons of mass destruction, it was needed to justify what was an illegal war. And crucially, I wrote this down to make sure I get it right. States are prohibited from using force except in self-defense or when authorized by the Security Council under Chapter 7. Now, no country had been attacked by Iraq in March 2003, and the Security Council never authorized the invasion of Iraq. Now, I'm now going to read, this is very serious, Tony Blair and George W. Bush committed an act of aggression. This is the most serious crime under international law. It's what Vladimir Putin committed when he invaded Ukraine 3 years ago. Yet the military tribunal at Nuremberg, when leading Nazis were tried after 1945, Justice Jackson, the United States Chief Prosecutor, defined a war of aggression as follows. He said, "To initiate a war of aggression, therefore, is not only an international crime, it is the supreme international crime, differing only from other war crimes in that it contains within itself the accumulated evil of the whole." Now, as a prime mover of the invasion of Iraq, alongside George W. Bush, I think it is reasonable to accuse the then British Prime Minister of committing, along with George W. Bush, the supreme international crime. Now, there are laws. How much longer have I got, by the way? 3.5 minutes. I mean, there are laws to deal with this, and the methods of doing so. Chief among them is the International Criminal Court. Now, when Lord Goldsmith gave his notorious evidence to Tony Blair ahead of the invasion, a lot of it was dedicated, his analysis, just to saying to Tony Blair, this is how you can get off it. What you're doing is wrong, but don't worry, they're not going to come after you. And central to that was that at that point, the International Criminal Court was incapable of prosecuting a war of the ultimate crime of aggression. Now, Victoria Jolly is going to come afterwards and tells me that I may be misinformed or not be giving the full story about that. I'm looking forward to hear from her. But what happened? I want to talk just very briefly, finally, in the current context here in Britain in 2024, about the terrible consequences of allowing Tony Blair to get away scot-free and George W. Bush on that attack on the international community, their attack on international law. They trashed international law when they invaded Iraq with the consent of the British political and media establishment. That set in motion a series of other events, the illegal removal of Gaddafi, which created total chaos, the blindness in Libya, the blindness to the genocide of the Rohingya in Myanmar, and now, of course, what the International Criminal Court is investigating as a possible genocide, and looks more and more like it in Gaza. We're seeing at the moment the Israeli state, generally backed and supported by the West, by America and Israel, killing UNIFIL, attacking UNIFIL. 250 or so UNRWA workers dead. Trashing the United Nations on a regular basis. Waging war on all of the institutions. I now take us back to 1945. The attempt to create a decent moral world order which accepted the rule of law. That moral world order was first threatened in a malicious way by Tony Blair and George W. Bush in 2003. Now, under Joe Biden, under Rishi Sunak, under Starmer, Britain is assenting to completely ripping up that world order which emerged after 1945, and that is why I do believe that the failure of the world to prosecute Bush and Blair has had immeasurable consequences. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that speech. We now head over to the first speaker for the opposition, Dr. James Strong. Dr. James Strong is a reader in British politics and foreign policy at Queen Mary University of London. He is the author of Public Opinion, Legitimacy and Tony Blair's War in Iraq, the first academic study of the Iraq War to respond to the findings of the Chilcot Report. He is currently working on a book about the role of the House of Commons in wartime. You have the ears of the House.
Members of the Cambridge Union, good evening. It's a great pleasure to be here, even if I did spend my formative years at the other place. I'm here to oppose the motion and to urge you to do the same, but what I'm not here to do is defend the invasion of Iraq. In fact, I suspect I will have a lot of agreement with the speakers in proposition to the motion. The invasion of Iraq was a major strategic blunder. It was a moral travesty, especially for the Iraqi people. It was unnecessary and it did not achieve its stated goals. I believe very strongly that you can oppose the invasion and oppose the motion before the House this evening. And in fact, my opposition to the motion is rooted in my opposition to the invasion. Because my goal above all is to avoid a repeat of the events of 2003 in future. I believe that the motion before the House, if carried, would not only fail to support that goal, it would actively work against it. The first reason why I oppose this motion and urge you to do the same is that it blames individuals for failures that were much broader, for failures that were collective failures and institutional failures, not just the failures of a small number of individuals. George W. Bush and Tony Blair were elected by the people of their country. They were given executive power. They were then re-elected after the invasion. After people knew what they would do with that power, they were re-elected. Right? Voters in those elections have a measure of collective responsibility here. Public opinion in the US was strongly in favour of the invasion. In the UK, slightly different picture. Very significant public opposition. That said, even in the UK, the day the tanks rolled across the border, opinion polls showed a majority in favour as well, which is one reason why neither Bush nor Blair suffered retribution.
Are you suggesting collective responsibility of the American and English people for the Iraq War? What good, how do politicians learn from their mistakes and their crimes unless they take responsibility? At Nuremberg, at the International Military Tribunal in Japan, we put German leaders and Japanese leaders on trial. We did that with Serbian war criminals in the 1990s. How can we achieve justice if people don't learn their consequences for their political leadership?
Absolutely, I think there should be consequences, but the primary consequence in a democracy, and you just described 3 non-democracies, is losing power through democratic means. I'm going to continue because I've just taken one already. Let me make some progress, please. Both the Congress and the UK Parliament strongly supported the invasion of Iraq. Right? Both voted strongly in favour. The UN Security Council has a measured responsibility for the ambiguity in the resolutions that it passed that allowed legal arguments to be made in favour of the invasion. The intelligence agencies overestimated the threat and in some cases got involved in playing politics in ways that's not really appropriate when you're supposed to be an advisor. Even the UN inspectors overestimated the threat. And we saw significant issues with groupthink among top decision makers. People like Colin Powell and Claire Short, people who were within the governments, who thought that the invasion was a bad idea, but decided to stay put instead of making a stand. Even Robin Cook, who did make a stand, who did resign from Tony Blair's government, who did make a speech in the House of Commons that I very strongly recommend you to go and listen to on YouTube, even he spoke to Alastair Campbell, Tony Blair's communications director, about how to minimise the political damage to Blair that would come from his resignation. George W. Bush and Tony Blair will not be in power again. The one thing that won't happen in future is those two individuals taking their countries to war. We know this. Some of these wider phenomena could recur. Go on.
I mean, I don't see how you think that's good enough of a punishment, but you seem to be accepting the idea that war crimes took place, but you think, oh, they're not coming to power again is enough. Sort of, right after World War II, all these Nazis, they lost power. For them, that's their punishment. No, it's not enough. If you think there are war crimes, then surely they need to actually be punished. I mean, say Netanyahu, you've made the same point, he's now been convicted by the ICC for war crimes. If he, his punishment could be, not being elected again, and that is not enough of a punishment. You're basically suggesting that leaders of democracies should have absolutely no, apart from the threat of losing their job, which is really not enough. Oh, I murdered someone. Oh, he lost his job. Poor him. Like that is, I don't understand your argument. It seems like you're just suggesting that there should be no accountability at all for democratic leaders.
Which leads me neatly onto my second reason for opposing the motion, which is that crime is not a good description for what went wrong. We've heard an analogy to companies law, which I didn't really understand. Apologies, Peter. But actually, most of the things that went wrong, most of the things you'd want to avoid in future were not legal violations. I can see Victoria's disagreeing with me here, but then she's a lawyer, so that's a slightly different situation. Misjudgment of the threat, right? Dodgy intelligence that was then misused. It's not actually a crime. It's bad. I'm not in favour of it, but it's not a crime, okay? Failing to plan for the day after, invading a country and not paying attention to what Colin Powell called the pottery barn rule. You broke it, you bought it, you have to fix it. Right? It's really bad. It is morally reprehensible. It's not actually a crime. Violations of the laws of war. Give me a minute. Let me make a bit of progress. I've taken 2. I'm doing quite well, I think. Violation of the laws of war. Wars are bad things, right? Even at the best of times, starting a war is a morally questionable thing to do. And as I've said already, starting an unnecessary war is a morally indefensible thing to do. But you're not going to find evidence of George W. Bush and Tony Blair ordering people to violate the rules of law, ordering people to commit crimes against humanity, which you did have in some of the cases that have been cited so far. And the reason you won't find that evidence is that it wasn't happening. Right? I've already said no to someone over here, so I'm going to make a bit more progress, please. The strongest argument is the argument for the crime of aggression, which I'll deal with in a moment. But even here, the prosecution, if you're going to prove to a jury, beyond reasonable doubt if you're in the US, so that the jury is sure if you're in the UK, that Tony Blair knowingly violated the UN Charter, you are going to have to deal with the fact that the Attorney General, the UK government's top legal advisor, gave him advice stating that it was legal. Right? That is going to be a problem in your prosecution case. It really is. Okay? I'm going to go to the person over here that I said no to the first time.
If we live in a country where, for example, rape is not punished as a crime because the government doesn't hold those values, does that make that crime any less bad just because it is not legally recognized?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not, but it makes it not prosecutable in a court. Right? Yes, it's definitely still bad, but that's what I'm saying. This is bad. This is very bad. This should not have happened. Right? It's just thinking about it in terms of a crime doesn't fit what actually happened and makes it harder to learn the lessons of what really did go wrong. How should you handle intelligence? How should you deal with questions of international law where there is room for debate? How do you take objective legal advice as a government when the top legal advisor is someone that you appoint to their job?
Point of information.
Go on.
You say that there's nothing that happened that you can prove is illegal whatsoever, but what would you say to the stated leaked evidence that shows that about Alberto Gonzalez, who was Bush's top legal advisor, sanctioned explicit violation of the Geneva Law when Iraqis were illegally detained without charge and removed out of the country onto black sites in Syria and Egypt where there was torture, no mechanism for accountability, evidence that was leaked, and it's undisputed. What do you say to that?
I say you'll have a hard time prosecuting George W. Bush over it. Yeah, certainly. Someone who worked for him gave some advice that allowed that to happen. Absolutely. I totally take that point. You'll have a hard time pinning it on Bush. I've got to make some progress because I'm out of time, and I think I've done quite well. So the final point that I wanted to raise is simply this one, the final reason why I oppose this motion and urge you to do the same. A prosecution is not going to happen. The motion says this House would prosecute those who led the invasion of Iraq. No, you wouldn't. There is no domestic court in either the US or UK that can hear that case. In the US, the Supreme Court has just ruled that presidents have blanket immunity for official acts. In the UK, the power of war and peace is a royal prerogative power. The courts don't have a say. There is no domestic court. There's also no international court. The International Criminal Court got jurisdiction over the crime of aggression in 2018, right? It's after the invasion of Iraq. It does not have jurisdiction. It cannot hear the case. The UN Security Council was the closest we had at the time, but the US and UK have vetoes because international law ultimately is a function of international power. And we're talking about great powers. Again, I'm not saying this is a good thing. I'm saying this is the unpleasant way that the world actually works. So, I am being asked to conclude. The motion cannot actually be implemented. For that reason, it is purely symbolic, and it glosses over what I think are the real lessons to be learned from this invasion. Intelligence is inexact, decision-making is vulnerable to groupthink, legislative oversight can help, but is not a silver bullet. It needs to be significantly improved. Voters need to care more about foreign policy and, frankly, about foreign people. And there is no such thing as a bloodless war. We should absolutely remember who was responsible for this war. I'm pleased this debate is happening tonight, considering most of the audience wasn't born at the time that the invasion was taking place. The historical reputation of Tony Blair and George W. Bush deserves to be linked inextricably to their failings in Iraq. But I do not think that a criminal prosecution is the way forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that round of paper speeches. Now, turning to you guys, the audience, for a floor speech. Just a reminder, the winning floor speech prize is 2 tickets to cocktail-making classes next week. So, yeah, would anybody like to speak in proposition of the motion this evening? Anybody in proposition? Down here. Just wait for a microphone, thank you. And say your name and college as well, please, thank you.
My name's Dexter Twycross. I'm at Corpus Christi. I agreed with pretty much everything that the opposition speaker just said, but I've got one question. Why is he choosing to define the leaders of the Iraq War as just Tony Blair and George W. Bush? He's already acknowledged that some of the people in power at the time who were making the decisions, who were calling the shots, were most likely guilty for the crimes that they committed in both domestic and international law. We don't need to restrict this to just the 2 big cheeses of the operation, the heads of state. we can still make the choice to prosecute those who we think we'd have a reasonable chance of taking down and making a point that would tarnish their legacy in the process. I think that there is good reason to go for this, to try to enact justice wherever we can, and even if it just means taking down the military leaders rather than trying to prosecute the heads of state, I think that it's a worthy cause regardless. Thanks.
Thank you. Would anybody like to speak in opposition of the motion? Anybody for opposition? No? Okay, abstention? To the gentleman up there. If you just wait a few seconds, someone will be able to hopefully bring you a microphone. If you could make your way towards there just to make it a bit easier as well. And name and college as well, thank you.
Thanks. Can you ask Chris if it's on? Thanks. Perfect. Thanks.
No, just there, stay there, it's fine.
Thank you. I'm Peter from Trinity. The truth is, in this country, after the war, the Second World War, Britain was a diminishing power. And we created international structures based on values of commonweal, of law, that would protect us as our military power fell. Britain's example in the world is not from its guns, its tanks, HMS Queen Elizabeth, but from being a nation that believes in the rule of law, that's perceived to be fair, efficient, well-governed. No, sorry, Sammy. And what Iraq did to this nation is it made us not a nation of commonweal, not a nation that followed the rules, but a nation that broke the rules. And the consequence of that is that that structure that we created, that web of protection that made other countries believe that they should act in a fair, proportionate, democratic way, was also broken. That is the flaw of Iraq, that we lost our influence, that we lost our reputation. But the problem is, and the reason why I'm abstaining, is those that fought the war, it's not a matter of prosecution. The issue is that they believe this nation to be an American colony, to follow someone else's foreign policy, not to act in the interest of the British people. Our troops believe they act in the interest of the British people. Prosecuting brave members of our military who were following the orders elected Parliament gave them is not in our national interest. Yes. Sorry, Sammy.
Forgive me, weren't there many brave German soldiers following orders?
That is true, but one would probably allege that the state of democracy in late Weimar Germany and under the Nazi Party was rather different to the Tony Blair era. I know you might have different opinions on Tony Blair, but it's not necessarily the comparison I would make. I think the truth is, politicians need to remember the fundamental value of this country, the fundamental value that's espoused in that famous Liberal Party song. The land was made for the people, so perhaps for those people they should act. Vote in abstention. Don't go into deluded elite games of who's responsible and who we prosecute.
I'll do anyone. Okay. And now, since we didn't have a speech in opposition, I'll now open to the floor for anybody to speak on any motion, any side that they'd like to speak. Anybody? Anybody new? No? Oh, at the back, there we go. Yeah, there we go. Name and college, please. And which side you're speaking on.
Point of information. Oh, no. Jesus fucking God. Sorry. Louis Goldberg, Robinson College. I'm not an expert on Iraqi history and politics. I did the module last year, so I wouldn't claim that. But I want to respond to some of the tropes I just keep bloody hearing. I mean, this whole distinction between, again, it came up, democracy and non-democracy. I don't understand how we were only obeying orders, get out of jail free card differs in a democracy and not a democracy. I mean, we can't prosecute any of our dear darling soldiers because our dear darling soldiers were being ordered by Her Majesty's democratic parliament, and if we tried to do that, that would be an elite game of blah, blah, blah. I don't understand that point. That's what I was trying to point of information you at the end for. That's pretty much all I had to say. I don't understand how that magical distinction, anything a democratically elected leader does is fine. Maybe the only way I would respect your argument about the difference between a democracy and not a democracy is if we arrested every single British person who voted for New Labour and said, okay, fair enough, we can't lock up the leaders for their decision. It was a collective British democratic decision. We're going to set up a big prison camp in Kent and send about 10 million voters there. I mean, by all means, why not? Thank you.
Thank you for that round of floor speeches. We now turn back to our paper speakers for the second speaker for the proposition, Dr. Victoria Stewart-Jolley. Dr. Victoria Stewart-Jolley worked as a legal advisor on electoral processes for the United Nations for over 15 years, holding positions in several countries, including Iraq, Afghanistan, Sierra Leone, and Libya. Having spent 4 years in post-invasion Iraq, her PhD focused on the democratization processes undertaken in Afghanistan and Iraq from both legal and international relations perspectives. She's currently a senior research fellow at the Anwar Gargash Diplomatic Academy in the UAE and a bi-fellow at Downing College. You have the ears of the House.
Well, I thought the member of the opposition's opening speech was really interesting. I learned shit. Let's go through what I learned. Cracking speech. We will not go after individuals. That's fantastic. That means there is no criminal law in this country anymore. Winner. Also, that resolutions are ambiguous. That one is particularly interesting. Trained rat could do a law degree. I should know, I did one. Basically, resolutions are written for idiots to read. They are idiot-proof. They are incredibly simplistic documents, and the fact that they are somehow ambiguous is bloody news to me. And in fact, I'll demonstrate that by reading you a bit of one in a little while. And the third bit, which was that the advice that was given by the Attorney General said that the invasion was legal. Sadly not so true. He started out with, no, this is absolutely bloody illegal, please don't do it. He then went to DC, where he was taken into a small room and no record of that conversation takes place. He left the room having a completely different idea about the war in Iraq and deciding that suddenly it was completely illegal to invade. Now, my question is, where did the electrodes go exactly? Or does he have a really nice new extension on his house? And in which case, brilliant, because apparently he can't be done for criminal behavior. Good start, really all round. So, let's get into the legality of the invasion of Iraq, because that is, after all, why I'm here. To explain it, we need to go back to 1999. Iraq invades Kuwait. Security Council passes Resolution 678, which allows for the use of force to expel Iraq. Job's a good one. They go in, they get rid of them. International order is restored. Nothing controversial in this at all. The intervening 10 years between 1991 and 2001 is marked by containment of Saddam Hussein and Iraq, and basically an attitude that nothing is going to happen. But there's one spoiler in the pack, and the spoiler is the man who becomes the vice president in 2000, Dick Cheney. Now, Cheney, in technical terms, is a nut job. He was a nut job in the 1960s. He continued to be a nut job in the 1970s. By the 1990s, he was absolutely fucking barking. This is a man who didn't believe that Gorbachev was dismantling communism and actually proposed that they nuclear bomb Moscow. Now, his boss was thankfully not such a nut job. This is Daddy Bush. And he basically said, no, that's even too extreme for the Republican Party. We're not going to do that. God, things have changed. Anyway, at that point, they turn around. He fires Cheney. But Cheney has already written a document in 1992 called the Defense Planning Guidance, which gives the blueprint for the invasion of Iraq. Not for the oil. No, that would be far too bloody logical. Not for, an existential threat. God forbid. No, it is entirely ideological. It is to create a haven of democracy in the middle of the Middle East. It is an actual ideological crusade. Now, that was shelved. No harm would have come had the bloody man not then been appointed as vice president, and then 9/11 happens. So suddenly you're pouring petrol on a nut job. Brilliant. And so this is re-established as the National Security Strategy of 2002, and it becomes the blueprint for going into Iraq. Now, Americans aren't, not all of them anyway, completely insane, and certainly weren't in those days. They did want, thank you, well noted, they did want the Security Council to sign off, and they put an enormous pressure on the Council to pass a resolution, which they did, Resolution 1441, which basically said that Iraq was dicking around, which they were. They were stopping inspections. They were basically making life extremely difficult for the scrutiny regime. And Saddam Hussein was playing a really stupid game of brinkmanship at this point in time. He was pretending he had weapons when he didn't, largely to posture to his regional neighbors more than anything else. Politics, who knew? Anyway, at this point, they adopt Resolution 1441, which says if Iraq messes up any more, the Security Council will reconsider the issue and possibly order a military strike. Now, the two clauses in question, operative paragraphs 4 and 12, says further material breach of Iraq's obligations will be reported to the Council for assessment. Fairly clear, huh? Yeah, the Americans then argue that that very, very easily understood piece of English language did not say that at all, that actually it said something completely different. And this is where the Attorney General comes into play, who at this point is completely in agreement that paragraph 4 says that if Iraq does something stupid, it has to go back to the Council for further discussion. He gets himself into that little broom cupboard in Washington, D.C., things are exchanged in one form or another, and he changes his mind. And don't take my word for it, this is all over the Chilcot Report, which is one of the most damning critiques of the decision-making that is associated with this abject folly that was the war in Iraq. Not only did they completely disregard that law, that binding resolution, they rode a coach and horses through it and lied to everybody that would listen. They sowed ambiguity, a bit like climate change. It's not really our fault. Or smoking, it's not really going to kill you. Neither of these things are true, and neither were the claims about the legality of the Iraq war. It was an illegal act. It was an illegal invasion. The Security Council did not ever sign off on that war of aggression, and they went in complete breach of the UN Charter, Chapter 7, and I can give you chapter and verse on this one. Now, the war, the act of aggression, the grounds for how we would prosecute these people, which apparently is not a crime in this country. Again, news to the people who signed the ICC Rome Statute, which you did sign in this country in November 2001 and ratify it, because Article 5, subsection 1, subsection D lists a crime of aggression. The issue was not that the crime of aggression wasn't in the statute, it was that they weren't 100% clear how they were going to apply it, which is what was actually decided in 2018, not that the act of aggression simply didn't exist before. So there is absolutely a ground to prosecute Tony Blair and any other British politician that was involved in this, but there is no political will to do so, because rules about criminal behaviour, they apply to the little person. They apply to the common man. They don't apply to those people. There are currently 2,700 people in this country on 99-year custodial licenses, one of whom is a guy called Thomas White, who was serving 99 years for the theft of a car. He's in jail. Blair's a fricking lord. I don't even know a reality where that sits. But let's think about what else happened. It wasn't just the illegality of the invasion, it was the illegality of the occupation. Under the laws of war, it is illegal to dismantle an army if you're occupying a state. Sorry? No, thank you. It is illegal to dismantle an army, it is illegal to dismantle a judiciary, it is illegal to dismantle a bureaucracy, it is illegal to steal money from the national exchequer. They stole 23 billion out of the Iraqi coffers. They fired the military. They fired the judiciary. They fired 3 million civil servants. They beggared half the country. Universal literacy now is at 60%. They destroyed that country, and they did it willfully, and then smugly sat back and drank white wine and congratulated themselves on their behavior, and every single one of them should rot in jail. I walked into Baghdad in October 2008 and saw with my own eyes the utter destruction that was wreaked on that country. I left 4 years later and could tell the difference between a Katyusha rocket, a car bomb, and a suicide bomber with amazing accuracy. I heard more bullets than I had hot dinners. And I saw the abject destruction of a country which was the cradle of civilization. The Iraqis at least had a sense of humor about it. They used to call the Americans the Visigoths without any irony. Half the shit that went down didn't even get to the papers. Let's just look at the raw death toll as my last 26 seconds. At a conservative estimate, 210,000 civilians. At a less than conservative estimate, in the first 3 years, 1 million excess deaths. 4,400 American soldiers, 31,000 American soldiers blown to bits but kept alive, 16,000 Iraqi military, 2,700 insurgents. Yeah, I'm sure it was justified. That was what the Iraq War was. 11 billion in cash just walked out the door as well. I mean, there was a whole financial crime that was involved in this that doesn't even bear thinking about. $1 trillion poured down the drain for hubris, folly, and ideology. And on that point, I rest. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that speech, and what a round of applause. Okay, we turn to our second speaker for the opposition, Udit Mahalingam. Udit is an LLM Master of Law student at Wolfson College. He won the right to speak through open audition. You have the ears of the House.
Ladies and gentlemen, today we have before us a motion that beckons to our sense of justice and moral outrage. It is a motion that may resonate with those who have longed to see accountability for one of the most controversial conflicts of our time. Indeed, when I first faced the task of trying to put together an opposition to this motion, I wrestled with it deeply. I firmly believe that prosecutions are a crucial component of the right to remedy, offering victims a pathway to justice and recognizing the harms suffered by millions in the conflict. I also believe that criminal accountability is essential to upholding international norms, ensuring that high-ranking officials are not afforded impunity for international crimes, such as the crime of aggression. I would even go so far to say that I agree with the underlying premise of the proposition's case, that prosecutions may be both necessary and normatively desirable, given the scale of harms associated with the conflict in Iraq. But I'm here to explore a question that goes beyond mere statutes and verdicts. The motion today isn't about can we or even should we prosecute. It's about would we, and more crucially, in my view, why would we? What would this achieve today, here and now? And so, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to give you 3 reasons why I think that the pursuit of prosecution now, so far removed from the initial conflict, won't bring the closure and the justice that Iraq needs today. Denied. First, let us consider the impact on Iraq itself. Nearly 2 decades after the invasion, Iraq is a nation still striving to piece itself back together. The Iraqi people have endured untold hardship, not just from the war itself, but from what followed. Civil conflicts, extremist groups rising in the power vacuum, the slow, grinding work of trying to rebuild a nation's identity amid the rubble. Now, it is the proposition's case that prosecution is an appropriate remedy, a panacea for the victims of the war. Yet justice is a far more multifaceted concept, one that goes beyond symbolic prosecutions. It involves other substantive measures, such as restitution, compensation, I'll take you in a minute, and rehabilitation that addresses the realities and needs of the Iraqi citizens. Thank you for that point. On the basis of what has been presented to you before, what the prosecution has implied to you is that a prosecution itself would be the necessary step to take, given the symbolic recognition that what occurred was wrong. Indeed, I think it's not in dispute amongst this House that what occurred is wrong. And if you let me continue with my speech, I'll explain why I think your point, though well-founded, and certainly one that I certainly agree with, is ultimately flawed. In my view, Iraq deserves to move on in its own terms, to be more than just a symbol in a Western courtroom. It deserves the resources to address core development challenges at a national level, be it access to documentation for the over 1 million of its displaced citizens, to the civic space so that NGOs can advocate for crucial protections like anti-domestic violence and child protection laws. These are ongoing struggles, urgent needs on the ground that form a vital part of the reality of life in Iraq. Now, if we were to seek recourse to prosecution, targeting the likes of Blair, Bush, and the countless others who led the war effort, we would essentially be dragging Iraq back into that painful history, putting them on the sidelines of their own story once again. What we need to ask ourselves is, would a prosecution actually help Iraq, or are we, in fact, far better placed to empower Iraq to shape its own future, rather than rehash old decisions? I'll take you in 1 minute. Now, my second point concerns the practical challenges to a meaningful prosecution. Now, to seek real accountability here would mean going beyond the high-profile figures like Bush and Blair to include the dozens, possibly hundreds of government officials and military leaders who played integral roles in planning and executing the war. Now, in theory, yes. Why not? I'll get to this in a minute. Now, this kind of expansive accountability could reshape our approach to international justice, making it more robust and equitable. That is certainly something that I would like to see, and certainly something I think the whole House would want to see. But in practice, unfortunately, such an endeavour is currently unworkable, given the structural deficiencies in our international legal system. Now, let's consider the International Criminal Court. Reference has already been made to this institution over the course of the speeches. This is the main institution established to address crimes of war and aggression. Now, unfortunately, the ICC lacks jurisdiction over non-signatory states, including the United States, which severely limits its power to prosecute former leaders or officials involved in the war. Now, for a prosecution to be meaningful, we would need a body capable of addressing the scale and complexity of this case. Yet the ICC's mandate and resources fall far short. Even if the ICC could sidestep its jurisdictional constraints, it would face significant barriers to securing evidence and cooperation from multiple countries, many of which resist and obstruct the process for political reasons. Taken.
So the ICC, from what I know, Netanyahu is currently, he has a criminal conviction with it. They haven't stopped doing that just because it doesn't have a practical effect. That doesn't... So Tony Blair and our leaders, shouldn't they still be prosecuted with them even if it isn't having what you say a practical effect, which isn't necessarily something that we should be considering because, as you said, it's symbolic.
Yeah.
We should still be going ahead with it.
So thank you for the point. The point I'd make here is that abandoning prosecution doesn't necessarily mean abandoning accountability. Now, instead of pursuing a flawed and lengthy process, I would submit that the international community could invest in alternative mechanisms, such as truth commissions, reparative justice, or even binding reforms to international law, which I'll get to over the course of my speech. Now, these measures would, in my view, unlike a symbolic prosecution, establish real deterrence against future aggression, while also working within the limitations of our existing system. I won't take any more point of information for now. Limiting prosecutions to top leaders, in my opinion, would create symbolic justice, but a thorough approach would require a sprawling investigation that could last for years, one that the international system is not fit to handle at present. Even with the legal frameworks in place, prosecuting high-ranking officials presents practical challenges that have consistently impeded justice. Without fundamental reforms, including an expansion of ICC jurisdiction, enhanced enforcement mechanisms, and solidified global cooperation, the pursuit of prosecution risks becoming an endless and ineffective process with no guarantee of a guilty verdict.
Isn't proving that our country and our leaders have legal viability a necessary precursor to Iraq receiving the financial compensation that you are striving for here?
So my view on that point is that I think the point you raise is a good one. You know, we need prosecution to establish, collate the evidence, to try the case against existing frameworks, and to facilitate recognition of wrongdoing. But we see now, in terms of political discourse, we already see that recognition coalescing. I am not foreclosing the possibility of prosecution now. What I'm simply suggesting is that at present, it is not a viable option. We need further political consensus to even effect a meaningful change in that regard. And indeed, to talk about international justice, to talk about the issues of recognition and accountability, we need to consider the precedent that this would set for international justice. The criminal prosecutions of former heads of state for acts performed in office is not a path to be taken lightly. Now, despite its rough edges, state immunity is a central pillar of the international legal order. Any derogation from that bears a danger of causing reciprocal action by other states and an erosion of the principle as such. Once we open this door, it's hard to close. Prosecutions of former leaders could easily become political tools, manipulated to serve the interests of those in power, the Bushes and Blairs of this world.
Why is it okay to take Milosevic to the court of justice and not okay to take Blair and Bush?
So you raise a particularly powerful point there. I am not for 1 minute suggesting that there is not an accountability gap in international law. But rather than simply speaking in hypothetical terms, whataboutism, in my view, is not a path to be taken here. What we need, in order to secure the prosecution of future acts such as this, is we need systemic reforms so that we can address the acts of the future, and even, if we have the capacity and resources to do so, address the issues of the past as well. I am not for 1 minute suggesting that differential treatment in this context is normatively desirable or even favorable to the interests of international justice. What I am suggesting is that before we can even talk about prosecution, we need to talk about reforming the system.
So what you're saying is that this House will attempt to close the accountability gap by not closing the accountability gap and actually,
Not at all. So again, I'm not here to minimize the profound harm that was caused by the Iraq War or to excuse the decisions to make it. What I am suggesting, as I have laid out in terms of my proposals for ICC reform, is that these would create the conditions for a meaningful prosecution, one that has the chance of a guilty verdict to occur. We can't talk about prosecution before we talk about the system in which that would occur. You know,
No back and forth, please.
Indeed, we owe it to Iraq, in my view, and to the world, to put our efforts and energy into meaningful support. Now, prosecution might satisfy some, but it won't address the root causes and consequences of what happened. Thank you.
Thank you for that round of paper speeches. Now, we turn to the floor. Would anybody like to speak in proposition of the motion this evening? Proposition. Anyone? Yeah, at the top there, if you just wait for a second, and there'll just be a microphone. Just two seconds. If someone could bring a microphone upstairs, that would be, yeah, amazing. Thank you. There we go, thank you. Name and college, please.
Yes. Nick Davis.
Order in the house, thank you.
Nick Davis, Girton College. I've only got a brief allotment of time, but I'd like to just address several things regarding the grave violation of international law. I could talk about the fact that prohibited cluster munitions were used in the initial invasion of Iraq, which have been explicitly prohibited. I could talk about the white phosphorus used in Fallujah against the Iraqi people there, explicitly prohibited. I could talk about the fact that 60% of the mosques in Fallujah, in an indiscriminate onslaught, were bombed to the ground and 20% of the buildings. But I think the initial invasion and the illegality of it and the illegality of means has been covered fairly comprehensively. One thing in the brief time I'm allotted I'd like to talk about is the CPA, which stands for the Coalition Provisional Authority. And that was effectively the absolute dictatorship the US set up to govern Iraq by decree between May 2003 and June 2004. In that time, they engaged in the illegal act of transformative occupation, which has already been touched upon. But part of that was fundamentally transforming Iraq's economy in order to impoverish it. 73.5% of contracts which were allotted to rebuild the economy of Iraq went into the coffers of American corporations. 200 private companies, 200 state-owned companies were privatized. Any foreign investment that foreign investors put into Iraq, 100% of it they could take out without having to pay any premium on tax. And if you were a corporation, 15% of your tax was slashed to 15%. Demonstrably, this went against any kind of strictures of UN Resolution 1483, which said the CPA had to provide for the well-being of the Iraqi people. How can it be said, and I'll leave this with the final thought, America impoverished Iraq illegally, used illegal means in order in the initial invasion, but the final point to make absolutely clear is why did the US go to such lengths to abnegate itself from any kind of legal accountability? If you look at the Status of Forces Agreement of 2008, what you'll find clearly is the US exempted itself from any prosecution under Iraqi law for its troops. If you look at the CPA, when they reset up the judiciary, which has been pointed out was illegal in and of itself, the reconstituted judiciary, which they said was free, fair and impartial, they placed themselves explicitly outside the bounds of. If they weren't committing war crimes, if there wasn't systematic illegality, why go to such extent in order to shield yourself from it? I'll leave you with a quote. On the eve of the war, one of George Bush's advisors said, "When we act, we create our own reality." And tonight, I think we've heard too much from the opposition trying to create their own reality, where breaking the law isn't breaking the law if you're a democracy. Breaking the law isn't breaking the law because Tony Blair isn't that bad, is he? You can't have it both ways. When you act, you can create the perception of your own reality, but you can't change the fact the law is the law and the law is broken and someone has to answer.
Thank you. Now, would anybody like to speak in opposition of the motion this evening? Anyone? Nobody at all? Okay. Abstention? Down here. Name and college, please.
Leo Hodjanowski, Pembroke. Many of the floor speakers have posed the question, don't the leaders of the Iraq War deserve to be punished? Wouldn't it bring their victims some measure of peace to see them clapped in iron? But I would remind this House that the proposition does not ask whether Tony Blair deserves to suffer, and that retribution is not in itself a just reason to apply the law. So I'd urge each of you to ask yourself if you wish to enact retribution or disincentivize recurrence. Punishment as strict as execution has not reduced crime, nor has execution's prohibition throughout much of the Western world led to a rash of violent crime. In the US, we've moved away from prosecuting firefighters for ineffective firefighting strategies because it incentivizes a circling of the wagons that ultimately keeps lessons from being learned and better policy from being instituted. Yes?
We have key figures such as Alastair Campbell who are now respectable members of liberal society. Does this look like a society that has, through the lack of punishment or retribution, learned the right lessons in any way?
Thank you. I move to my next point. So I challenge any supporter of this motion to explain why prosecuting the leaders of the Iraq War would prevent a future leader with a mandate from a course just as damning. Would that effort not be better spent instituting restrictions on future wars of aggression and condemning the actions of the state, as Korematsu v. the United States condemned the internment of Japanese Americans during the Second World War? Because while Dick Cheneys of the world will recur, they are bounded by the legal and legislative framework in which they operate. So let's make, yes?
Throwing shoes and hitting people with shoes. This is all about retribution. And if you're going to ask the Iraqis what they've got, because they're the main people, they're the people who matter, they're the people who have suffered. And I think they would say, throw a shoe at Tony Blair, throw a shoe at George Bush. And so this whole, oh, well, what would it really fit? And you could say the same thing about any crime, or should we arrest this murderer? Oh, no, it's not going to bring back the victim. No, listen to the Iraqi people. Get your shoes out and chuck your shoes.
I would rather prevent future mass murder than to sate the vengeance of victims. So let us make the Bushes and Blairs of the world miserable on our own time and use the law to achieve a more just world order.
Okay, and finally, since once again there was no speech in opposition, would anybody like to speak in proposition or abstention again? We'll go just there with the glasses and the shirt. Yeah, just name and college, please. And what side you're speaking on as well.
Thank you. I'm speaking for the proposition Zain Ali Downing College. So some of you may have come across the Abu Ghraib prisons in Iraq. Those of you who haven't, take my advice, don't look at the photos, just read, okay? These were horrific. Any torture method that you can think of and worse took place there. Now, the reason I mention this is not because that the opposition are arguing that bad things didn't happen in Iraq War, but they're arguing that we can't feasibly prosecute those who carried out acts of effectively war crimes. Now, when news broke out about Abu Ghraib, the president at the time of the US, George Bush, claimed that this was an isolated incident and it would not be repeated. However, further on, documents were released which had authorized these actions in these prisons that were produced by the US DOJ, Department of Justice, who was headed by the Attorney General, who reports to the President. And these documents were later known as the torture memos because of how ridiculous their propositions were. But their defense within these documents were that they do not violate international humanitarian law. The US Supreme Court overruled this in a complicated and detailed history that you can look into later. In 2006, they overruled this and in fact do violate the Geneva Conventions. Now, I want you guys to all understand what punishments came to those individuals that were involved. Around 17 soldiers were released from their duties. Around a dozen were charged. 2 received harsh punishments. Bush and his defense secretary at that time apologized. That's all they did. And the brigadier general who was in charge of the Iraqi detention camps at that time was demoted. Not even sacked. He was demoted to colonel. That's it. So when you walk through those doors tonight, I want you to think, we already have some level of prosecution that has happened before. Do you believe the opposition when they say that prosecution cannot take place? Or do you believe that those 36 known people in Abu Ghraib prison who were killed, it was probably a lot more, and hundreds who were tortured, do you believe that they deserve more when you vote? Thank you.
Thank you for that round of floor speeches. We now turn to the final paper speaker for the proposition, Andrew Murray. Andrew Murray is the Vice President and founding member of the Stop the War Coalition and was chair from 2001 to 2011, marching against the Iraq War in 2003. He has previously worked as Chief of Staff at Unite the Union and advisor to Jeremy Corbyn. He's written several books, including The Fall and Rise of the British Left and Stop the War and Its Critics. You have the ears of the House.
Let me first commend the Cambridge Union on debating this issue, which, although it fast recedes in the rearview mirror of history, remains, amidst stiff competition, the greatest crime of this century. I said amidst stiff competition, and you will forgive me if I trespass on your tolerance, but I will not speak here or anywhere, or on this subject or any other, without taking the opportunity of expressing my solidarity with the Palestinian people in the ordeal they are presently suffering. Now, I commend too the speeches of those opposing the proposition. It's not an easy job. This is not an issue on which the jury is still out. All those in politics and the media who rallied to this standard of supporting the Iraq aggression have long since fled. So they have, unsurprisingly, taken an original turn in their arguments, and I shall come back to some of those in a second. But their job is made no easier by the nature of the proposition before you that this House would prosecute those who led the Iraq War. I think, with respect, Mr. Strong was in error in suggesting that this invites you to decide beyond reasonable doubt. You are not here as a jury, although if you were, I would have no hesitation in hoping that I could convince you that the people we are talking about as criminals. You are here more in the role of the Crown Prosecution Service, deciding on whether there is a reasonable case to be answered that might lead to a conviction. I believe that case is unanswerable. We have heard from Dr. Stuart Jolly and Peter Oborne on the legalities and on the crime of aggressive war, which is the issue here. There are many and enormous subsidiary crimes that have been committed. We have heard of them too. The conservative estimates of hundreds of thousands of dead, the facts of millions of refugees displaced, the ruination of a society that will endure for generations, the stirring up of sectarian strife. These are all crimes, but they are subordinate crimes to the one of aggressive war, the supreme crime in international law, of waging a war under circumstances under which neither of the tests laid down in international law for its lawful prosecution have been met. Neither imminent aggression against yourself nor sanction of the United Nations Security Council. Now, the speakers for the opposition have tried to evade this. We have been told that you can't blame individuals because it's all a collective, as if those who seek and hold high power in their societies do not thereby also acquire high responsibility. Power without responsibility, the prerogative of the harlot, in the words of Stanley Baldwin, but that is what we are being invited to endorse. Secondly, that they were elected or re-elected. Well, and so they were, but not by the living of Iraq, never mind the dead. And I can assure Mr. Strong that if I should so far forget myself as to despoil his property and assault his family, I will not simply say, my friends made me do it, and anyway they voted, I'm a jolly good fellow. Or at least I would not rely on such arguments in court. So we had first an exposition, an acknowledgement that probably calamities at any event, if not crimes, had been committed, but no one could be held responsible for it. And then we had the argument that maybe it wasn't a crime at all, except possibly the war of aggression was, but there isn't a court that can try it. Well, we heard the gentleman speaking there who referred to the case of Milosevic. Long before the establishment of the ICJ, a special tribunal was set up at The Hague to hold him to account for crimes committed in the wars attendant upon the dissolution of Yugoslavia. So there are means that it can be done. Now, Mr. Mahallingham says the people of Iraq probably wouldn't want it. I doubt very much if that is the case, and I could identify to my own knowledge here dozens of Iraqis who believe that a reckoning for what was done to their country is essential for its future health and well-being. And then he speaks of state immunity. But what has been advocated is not state immunity, it is state impunity. The right of the powerful states in the world to behave as they will to the weaker states, to pray in aid, arguments found to be spurious, founded on lies, on ridiculous intelligence, and all sorts of all unmeritorious arguments for allowing the powerful to do as they will to the weaker states in the world. Now, this was a war of aggression. They knew. Why did Tony Blair seek so hard to secure a second resolution in its favour from the Security Council, then submitting, as we've heard, Lord Goldsmith, the Attorney General, to all manner of indignities before, at the third or fourth time of asking, he could produce an opinion which would give some cover to the illegality Blair was contemplating it? He wanted that second resolution because he knew he needed the cover, and he did not get it and went ahead anyway. So the case is overwhelming that a crime was committed. Can we identify, though, criminals, individuals who could be held accountable? I believe we can. This is not, the British state is not an amorphous collective in which everyone and no one is accountable for its actions. It is a state led by a government and headed by a man who lied to the British people. He misled them as to his intentions. He had pledged a year before the invasion to George Bush that we will follow you wherever you go. And that he did not say that to the British people. He talked about the iniquities of the Saddam regime, real enough, but no foundation in international law for any form of action. And then he embarked knowing that he was breaking international law when he did not secure the sanction of the UN Security Council, which he realised was essential. And he set out Jack Straw, happily. Many of you are too young to remember Jack Straw, the undignified foreign secretary, who paraded around at the time saying, brandishing the United Nations Charter, saying, we have been blocked by an unreasonable veto, by the French, as it happened. And if you read the UN Charter from beginning to end, the concept of unreasonable veto does not exist. The words are not in there. A veto is a veto, and at least 3 of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council would never have voted for the act of illegality that was embarked upon. So we have Tony Blair. Peter Oborne made reference to the ghoulish duo of security duo of John Scarlett, head of the Joint Intelligence Committee at the time, Richard Dearlove, head of MI6, who happily colluded with Alastair Campbell and others to manipulate intelligence to fit the policy that the government was set upon. So I say Blair, Straw, Scarlett, Dearlove and Goldsmith, at the very least, should account for their actions. That is the legal case, but there is too a moral case. This war has hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of victims. Let me just mention 2. Let me mention Hanan Matrood, an 8-year-old girl shot dead in Basra in 2004 by a British soldier. She was compensated £390 for the loss of her life. Do her parents, her family, Do they not deserve their day in court? Do they not deserve to see the authors of this enterprise held to account, made to defend themselves? Maybe they can do it successfully. That is not what this House has been asked to consider today. Should they be held to account? Consider too Gordon Gentle, a 19-year-old British Fusilier from Glasgow. He too died in Iraq. He too is a victim of this enterprise. His mother was brave enough to stand with us in the Stop the War coalition to say, my son has died for a lie. Those who sent him to his death, they too should be accountable. So I submit this is an open and shut case to support this proposition. And I ask this House to join the 2 million of us who marched in advance of the war through the streets of London to say this is a criminal enterprise that our country should have no part of. Join every serious legal scholar around the world who acknowledges that this is a crime that should never have been committed and for which people should be held accountable. Reject the doctrine of state impunity for the Bushes and Blairs and their successors in the world. Join the union of virtually every country and all thinking people around the world and support this proposition.
Thank you for that speech. We now turn to the final speaker for the opposition, Adi Misha. Adi is a third-year student studying law at Jesus College, where he resides as president of the JCR. He won the right to speak through open audition. You have the ears of the House.
Mr. President, thank you. Members of the House. For those of you waiting in avid anticipation of my full-scale defense of the Iraq War, I'm afraid you will be disappointed. The argument I seek to persuade you of tonight is not that the Iraq War was necessary or justified or absent of any atrocities. The fundamental premise of my argument tonight is that criminal responsibility in international law has a special significance, and this special significance ought not be diluted. Members of the House, I was slightly disappointed by Dr. Stuart Jolly's speech. The crime of aggression requires not only that warfare be illegal, but that it be manifestly illegal for criminal responsibility as opposed to state responsibility to arise. Members of the House, my second argument will be what I call the ambiguous case for war. The case for war was not strong, but there were some justifications for war, such that the specific level of aggression and illegality required by the crime of aggression were not satisfied. Thirdly and finally, I will argue that criminal responsibility for specific acts, such as war crimes and torture, require a nexus between the person in command, i.e. the leaders, and the individuals carrying out the attacks or the acts. At least with respect to atrocities in the Iraq War, I say this cannot be established. Members of the House, on the 1st of October 1946, members of a monstrous regime were held responsible for various international crimes. 12 were convicted for their planning and execution of acts of aggression. Such acts stemmed from a premeditated plan to reshape the European order in a way that fit their evil agenda. 2 years later, 18 more were held responsible for their own acts of aggression in their leadership of Imperial Japan. Thus far, the trials of Nuremberg and Tokyo have been the only instances in which the crime of aggression has been prosecuted. This is because, to quote the Nuremberg judgment, and this is a quote you've heard many times tonight, the war of aggression is the supreme international crime, differing only from other war crimes in that it contains within itself the accumulated evil of the whole. I read on. The aggressive designs of the Nazi government were not accidents. They were a deliberate and essential part of Nazi foreign policy. Two things were deemed to be essential: the disruption of the European order and the creation of a greater Germany. Members of the House, the crime of aggression in international law requires a very specific form of aggression, a planned subjugation or annexation. It goes beyond just illegal warfare. The same is true under modern definitions. Under the Rome Statute, an act of aggression must constitute a manifest violation of the Charter of the United Nations for criminal responsibility to arise. Illegal war will make states responsible under international law. That is true. But not all acts of aggression will give rise to criminal responsibility. That is reserved for the most disgusting, perverse, and obvious acts of illegality.
Point of information. It states quite clearly in the review of the Kampala case, Uganda 2010, that the use of armed force, the crime of aggression, is defined by a state against the use of armed force by a state against the sovereignty, integrity, or independence of another state. With none of the aggrandizement that you've bartered the concept with.
I have read directly from the statute, the Rome Statute, that defines the crime of aggression. Yeah. And it states that manifest violation of the Charter of the United Nations is necessary. Otherwise, what would be the difference between having state responsibility for illegal war and criminal responsibility? There's clearly a difference, and that's contained in the Rome Statute. I'll move on now to my second submission. War may have been illegal, but it was certainly not manifestly illegal. The case for war was sufficiently ambiguous at the time, such that we cannot ascribe criminal responsibility to its leaders. As has been pointed out, in 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait, prompting the UN Security Council to pass Resolution 678, authorizing states to use all necessary means to restore peace and security in the area. After a successful coalition military campaign, Iraq agreed to a ceasefire under Resolution 687, under which it was required to dismantle its WMD program and allow in UN inspectors. Failure to comply with these terms would breach the ceasefire and potentially reactivate authorization for force under Resolution 678. Therefore, I put it to the House that if credible evidence suggested that Iraq remained in breach, this legal basis could potentially justify intervention, as they sought to argue at the time. For that, we do need some evidence. Yes?
The problem is we know that that basis for the information was not credible. It's an extraordinary step under international law to get to invasion. And we know that the basis, not just from what we know now, but from what was also being told at the time by many senior experts, was simply not credible and was manufactured. And therefore, how can you possibly say, especially given what we know about how legal advice was pressured, how can you possibly say that there was a credible case that Iraq was in breach of that resolution?
What I would say is I would compare this to what we saw in the judgments of the Nuremberg and Tokyo trials, which is that if you compare this to the acts of aggression in those cases, here there was an attempt to put forth a legal basis. There was some legal justification. Even if we say it was not good enough, my argument is that we didn't see manifest illegality in this instance. And I think it's important that criminal responsibility corresponds to the differing levels of moral wrongs. Sorry, I must make progress. I'll move through the evidence of WMDs very briefly. Saddam Hussein had used chemical weapons against his own population in the past and was thus seen as willing to use them. By 1999, the UN Special Commission had found and destroyed a substantial quantity of biological and chemical weapons, but they did note that Iraq had sought to conceal WMDs and that not all destruction was conducted under the supervision of the UN. Finally, after Resolution 1441, there was some non-compliance from Iraq that continued.
On a point of information, are you denying that Hans Blitz reported to the United Nations, Hans Blitz being the inspector who was charged with discovering any evidence of weapons of mass destruction? He reported that there was no evidence that he had discovered and that he was receiving full cooperation from the Iraqi government.
My point is not that their case was strong. It was by no means concrete evidence, nor was it sufficient, but it outlines a case for war that is based on some legal justification. The German and Japanese leaders of World War II did not even attempt to provide legal justification, There was no claim of legal or factual basis. They did not see themselves as upholding international law. Their invasions were purely aggressive and part of an expansionist ideology. Sorry, no, I must make progress. As to my final point on war crimes, it is true that atrocities were committed in Iraq. The abuses committed by soldiers and guards at Abu Ghraib will forever be a stain on human history. But those individuals were prosecuted or court-martialed. What we are looking for is evidence of direct authorization from those that led the Iraq War to undertake specific actions which constituted torture or other forms of prohibited treatment. Many argue that the various torture memos that were produced by the US contributed to the use of abusive methods of interrogation. What I say in response is that there is no evidence of express statements from the leaders of the Iraq War in relation to Iraq itself authorizing enhanced interrogation techniques. Rumsfeld did authorize enhanced interrogation methods at Guantanamo Bay, but later rescinded this. Sorry, no, I don't have any time left. I will conclude now. Why does this matter? States should be held accountable for illegal warfare, but we should reserve criminal responsibility for the clearest and worst instances of evil. The difficulties in attributing command responsibility to the leaders of the Iraq War and the ambiguous justifications for the Iraq War means that this does not fit within the same category as past war crimes. The Holocaust, the subjugation of peoples in Europe and Asia, the permitting of mass rape and genocide in Yugoslavia, these are all of a very different nature. They were top-down, manifest instances of illegality. Therefore, I plead with members of the House to vote against this motion tonight, if only to retain the moral structure of war crimes. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that round of paper speeches. One brief notice before we vote, that the Winter Ball tickets are still selling out. So if you would like to attend the best evening in Cambridge this term, do check online on our Instagram. I'd say the floor prize has to go to the gentleman up there for his very compelling case. So do see me after to talk about cocktail classes. And in this house, we vote with our feet. So at the back, you see the ayes, the nays, and the abstentions in the middle. Please make your choice walking through the door and join us in the orator for free chips and drinks, and the results will be announced. Thank you.